The most painful seat in the room is the one reserved to remind you that you no longer belong. Claire Whitmore saw her name before she saw anything else. The small ivory card rested neatly on a table near the back of the ballroom, tucked beside a service station where waiters slipped in and out carrying trays of champagne and sparkling water. The seat was impossible to miss. And impossible to misunderstand. Around her, crystal chandeliers scattered warm gold light across the room. Laughter drifted through the air. Glasses clinked softly. A string quartet played near the marble staircase, filling the ballroom with elegant notes that seemed to float beneath the high ceiling. It was the kind of wedding people posted online and talked about for years. Claire stood still for a moment, her fingers lightly resting on the silver clutch in her hand. Then she smiled. Not because the placement didn't hurt. It did. Not because she hadn't noticed what it meant. She had. But because she had learned something over the past 4 years. Some invitations were never meant to welcome you. They were meant to test whether you still carried old wounds. Across the room, Ethan Brooks stood with effortless confidence, greeting guests beneath a canopy of white roses. His tailored tuxedo fit perfectly. His posture radiated success. Beside him stood Vanessa Reed, beautiful and polished, her hand resting lightly on his arm as photographers moved around them. Together, they looked exactly like the kind of couple people expected to see on the cover of a luxury magazine. Ethan glanced across the ballroom and found Claire almost immediately. For the briefest second, their eyes met. Claire noticed the subtle change in his expression. Not surprise. Not happiness. Expectation. As though he had been waiting to see how she would react. As though this entire evening contained a private performance meant for an audience of one. Claire looked away first. Not because she felt defeated. Because she no longer felt the need to participate. She lowered herself into the chair and smoothed the fabric of her navy blue dress. It wasn't the most expensive dress in the room. It wasn't designed to attract attention. But it fit her perfectly, and for the first time in years, she wore it without wondering whether someone else approved of it. Around her, conversations continued. A few guests recognized her. Some offered polite smiles. Others whispered quietly when they thought she couldn't hear. Claire ignored all of it. The old version of herself would have counted every glance. She would have replayed every whisper during the drive home. She would have wondered what people thought. Tonight, she simply watched the candlelight flicker against the glass centerpieces and listened to the music. Then something unexpected happened. The seat beside her remained empty. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Guests filled every table throughout the ballroom, yet the chair next to Claire remained untouched. She studied the place card resting there. No name. Just an empty setting waiting for someone who had not arrived. A strange feeling settled in her chest. Not anxiety. Curiosity. On the far side of the room, Ethan glanced toward her again. This time his confidence seemed slightly forced. Almost as if he was checking whether the evening was unfolding according to plan. Claire lifted her glass and took a slow sip of sparkling water. Her smile never disappeared. Because while Ethan believed this wedding would remind her of everything she had lost, he had no idea that the most important chapter of her life had already begun. And before the night was over, the empty seat beside her would change everything. The empty chair remained untouched long enough for Claire Whitmore to notice a pattern. Guests continued arriving through the grand ballroom doors in waves. Women in elegant dresses crossed the polished marble floor. Men adjusted cufflinks and greeted old friends with easy laughter. Servers moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water and champagne. Yet no one claimed the place setting beside her. It sat there like a question waiting for an answer. Claire traced the rim of her glass and watched the room without appearing to watch it. For years ago, she would have felt uncomfortable sitting alone. For years ago, silence had felt like judgment. Tonight, silence felt different. It felt earned. Across the ballroom, Ethan Brooks was surrounded by people. Every few minutes another guest stopped him to shake his hand. He smiled constantly, but Claire noticed something subtle beneath the polished surface. His attention kept drifting back toward her table. It happened once. Then twice. Then again. Each glance lasted only a second. Just long enough to confirm that she was still there. Just long enough to see whether she looked bothered. Whether she looked lonely. Whether she looked exactly the way he expected. Claire gave him nothing. The string quartet shifted into a softer melody. Candlelight danced across the crystal centerpieces. Somewhere near the entrance, a burst of laughter echoed through the room. Claire turned her attention toward the dance floor and let the evening continue around her. Then she heard familiar voices from a nearby table. They were not trying to be cruel. In some ways, that made it worse. "I heard she never remarried," one woman whispered. "That is sad." Another voice answered quietly. Well, Ethan clearly moved on. Claire kept her eyes forward. She had spent years learning that people often mistook incomplete information for truth. They saw wedding rings and assumed happiness. They saw expensive suits and assumed fulfillment. They saw someone sitting alone and assumed loneliness. The truth was rarely that simple. She remembered a rainy Tuesday nearly 3 years earlier. A tiny apartment. A second-hand couch. Bills spread across a kitchen table barely large enough for 2 people. She remembered eating takeout noodles while searching job listings late into the night. No applause. No support. No audience. Just determination. Back then, every small victory had mattered. A successful interview. A paycheck arriving on time. The first morning she woke up without replaying old arguments in her head. Those moments had built something stronger than confidence. They had built peace. A sudden movement near the front of the ballroom pulled Claire back to the present. Vanessa Reed was speaking with several guests while photographers gathered nearby. Her engagement ring caught the chandelier light and flashed like a tiny star. Ethan stood beside her, smiling for another photograph. The image looked perfect. Almost too perfect. Claire watched for a moment before lowering her gaze. That was when she noticed something unusual. Ethan was no longer looking at the photographer. He was looking directly at her again. This time there was something different in his expression. Not satisfaction. Not victory. Confusion. As though the evening was unfolding incorrectly. As though she was failing to play the role he had assigned her years ago. Claire lifted her glass and took a calm sip. The empty seat beside her remained vacant. But for the first time all night, she had the strange feeling that someone was coming. And somewhere deep inside, beyond the music and the conversations and the glittering lights, she sensed that the real story of this evening had not even begun. Claire Whitmore could feel it before she understood it. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had begun to shift. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But after years of learning how to survive disappointment, she had become unusually good at recognizing subtle changes. The music continued. The laughter remained. Crystal glasses still caught reflections from the chandeliers above. Yet something invisible had entered the room. Something that made people glance toward the entrance every few moments. Claire followed one of those glances and saw nothing unusual at first. The doors remained closed. Guests continued mingling. A wedding coordinator crossed the lobby carrying a clipboard. Everything appeared normal. And yet the empty chair beside her suddenly felt less mysterious and more deliberate. She looked down at the untouched place setting. The silverware remained perfectly aligned. The folded napkin had not moved. Whoever was meant to sit there was running late. Or arriving exactly when they intended to. Across the room, Ethan Brooks accepted another handshake. His smile remained polished, but Claire noticed he was speaking less than before. More importantly, he had stopped looking at her. That alone was unusual. Earlier in the evening, his attention had drifted toward her repeatedly. Now it was fixed elsewhere. Toward the ballroom entrance. Toward the same place everyone else seemed to be watching. Vanessa Reed leaned closer to him and said something that drew a brief laugh. Ethan nodded. Yet even from a distance, Claire could tell his focus was divided. Like a man waiting for confirmation that everything was proceeding according to plan. The wedding coordinator suddenly appeared near the front of the room and whispered something to the event manager. The manager straightened immediately. Within seconds, 2 staff members moved toward the entrance. Claire watched the exchange carefully. Important guests arrived late all the time. But staff did not usually react this way. The ballroom doors opened. Conversations softened almost instantly. Not because someone famous had entered. Not because anyone recognized the newcomer. But because certain people carried themselves differently. A tall man stepped inside. Dark navy suit. No flashy accessories. No dramatic entrance. No attempt to attract attention. He simply walked into the room with the calm confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. Claire felt her heartbeat pause for half a second. Not from surprise. Recognition. Lucas Sterling. He spotted her almost immediately. And when he smiled, the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into the background. There was nothing theatrical about the expression. Nothing calculated. Just warmth. Genuine and effortless. The kind that reached his eyes. Claire had not realized how tense her shoulders were until they relaxed. Lucas crossed the room at an unhurried pace. Several guests stepped aside without realizing they were doing it. Others glanced at him curiously before returning to their conversations. To most people in the ballroom, he was simply a well-dressed man arriving late. Claire stood as he approached her table. "I hope I did not keep you waiting too long," he said. His voice was calm, familiar, reassuring. Claire smiled. "You are right on time." Lucas pulled out the empty chair and sat beside her. For the first time that evening, the place setting no longer looked like a symbol of isolation. It looked exactly what it had been intended to become. A reserved seat. Across the ballroom, Ethan happened to look in their direction. His expression froze. Only for a second. Barely noticeable. But Claire saw it. And for reasons she could not yet explain, she suddenly had the feeling that the evening Ethan had carefully imagined was beginning to slip beyond his control. Lucas Sterling settled comfortably into the chair beside Claire Whitmore as though he had always belonged there. Not in the ballroom. Not at the wedding. Beside her. The realization surprised Claire more than she expected. Around them, the evening continued with polished elegance. Servers refreshed glasses. Soft music drifted beneath conversations. Guests smiled, laughed, and shared stories beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Yet for the first time since arriving, Claire felt completely detached from the performance unfolding around her. Ethan Brooks was no longer the center of her attention. The ballroom faded. The whispers faded. Even the uncomfortable memories that had followed her through the doors seemed quieter now. Lucas glanced toward her and smiled. "You look relieved." Claire laughed softly. "Do I?" "A little." His eyes moved briefly around the room. "Although I am not sure this was ever my favorite kind of evening." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You attend enough of them." "That does not mean I enjoy them." His answer made her smile again. That was one of the things she appreciated most about Lucas. He never seemed impressed by status. Not his own. Not anyone else's. For years earlier, she would not have understood how rare that was. Back then, her life had revolved around proving things. Proving loyalty. Proving patience. proving she was supportive enough, understanding enough, forgiving enough. The memories arrived quietly. Not sharp enough to hurt anymore. Just present. She remembered the small apartment she and Ethan had shared during their first years together. The old coffee maker that only worked if someone tapped the side twice. The folding table they used as a dining room set because they could not afford anything larger. She remembered believing they were building something together. Every sacrifice had felt temporary. Every compromise had felt meaningful. When Ethan worked late, she waited. When opportunities appeared for him, she encouraged them. When money was tight, she adjusted. She never kept score because she thought they were on the same team. The music shifted to another song. Claire looked down at the table and lightly traced the edge of her water glass. Somewhere between those early years and the end of their marriage, something had changed. Ethan had become more successful. More ambitious. More concerned with appearances. Slowly, conversations became evaluations. Support became expectation. Appreciation became assumption. Then one day she realized she was spending all her energy protecting a relationship that only one person was fighting to save. The memory no longer brought anger. Only clarity. "You disappeared for a minute," Lucas said gently. Claire blinked and looked up. "Just remembering. The bad years?" She considered the question. "The years that taught me something." Lucas nodded as though he understood exactly what she meant. And maybe he did. That was another difference. He never rushed to fix her emotions or rewrite her experiences. He simply listened. Across the ballroom, Ethan stood with a group of guests, but his attention drifted again. Claire noticed it immediately. This time, Lucas noticed too. He followed her gaze for a brief moment before returning his focus to her. No jealousy. No insecurity. No performance. Just calm confidence. "You know," Lucas said quietly, "some people spend their entire lives chasing success and never figure out what actually matters." Claire studied him for a second. "And what matters?" Lucas smiled. "The people who make you feel like yourself." For a moment, the noise of the ballroom seemed distant. And sitting there beneath the warm glow of candlelight, Claire realized that the greatest thing she had rebuilt after her divorce was not her career, her independence, or even her confidence. It was her ability to recognize the difference between being valued and merely being tolerated. The first time Claire Whitmore met Lucas Sterling, she almost walked past him without noticing. The memory returned unexpectedly as she sat beside him in the ballroom. Sometimes life changed through dramatic moments. Sometimes it changed because someone asked a simple question at exactly the right time. 3 years earlier, Claire had been sitting alone in a neighborhood coffee shop on a cold October morning. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air. Her laptop sat open in front of her beside a notebook crowded with plans, budgets, and job applications. She had spent nearly 6 months rebuilding her life after the divorce. Every dollar mattered. Every decision mattered. Every small step forward felt hard-earned. She remembered staring at a spreadsheet and wondering whether she was being unrealistic. Maybe starting over in her late 30s was harder than she wanted to admit. Maybe some lives never fully recovered after being broken apart. Then someone accidentally placed a coffee cup on her table. Claire looked up. A tall stranger stood there holding another cup. "I think I just stole your table," he said with an apologetic smile. Claire glanced around. The shop was unusually crowded. Every other seat was occupied. "Looks like you did." He laughed. "Can I buy you another coffee as an apology?" Under normal circumstances, she would have declined. But something about his tone felt genuine. No performance. No charm offensive. Just simple kindness. 15 minutes later they were discussing books, travel, and favorite cities. They never discussed money. They never discussed status. And most importantly, they never discussed the painful parts of her past. Lucas treated her like a person standing at the beginning of a future rather than someone trapped inside an old story. Back in the ballroom, Claire glanced toward him. He was listening attentively to an older guest seated across the table. The conversation seemed ordinary, yet Lucas gave it his full attention. That quality had never changed. People often assumed confidence came from being the loudest voice in a room. Lucas proved otherwise. Across the ballroom, Ethan Brooks appeared increasingly distracted. Claire noticed him checking his phone before slipping it back into his pocket. Then another glance in her direction. Then another. Vanessa Reed was speaking animatedly to several guests, but Ethan seemed unable to fully focus on any conversation. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Years ago, Claire would have interpreted every glance as validation. Tonight, she viewed them differently. They revealed uncertainty. And uncertainty often appeared when expectations collided with reality. A server arrived with dinner plates. Soft conversations filled the ballroom as guests settled into their seats. The wedding celebration was moving into its next phase, yet Claire sensed another story quietly unfolding beneath the surface. Several guests had begun paying attention to Lucas. Not openly. Just curious glances. A longer look than before. A moment of recognition that never fully formed. One man near the neighboring table narrowed his eyes as though trying to remember where he had seen Lucas before. Lucas either did not notice or did not care. He thanked the server, adjusted his napkin, and continued speaking with the same easy calm that had defined every interaction Claire had ever had with him. The chandeliers cast warm reflections across the ballroom as Claire leaned back slightly in her chair. For years she had believed success looked like what Ethan had pursued. Recognition. Prestige. Applause. Yet sitting beside Lucas, she understood something entirely different. Real confidence never demanded attention. It simply existed. And judging by the growing curiosity spreading quietly through the room, it would not remain unnoticed much longer. By the time dinner was served, the energy inside the ballroom had changed in ways most people could not explain. Nothing dramatic had happened. No announcements had been made. No secrets had been revealed. Yet conversations seemed to pause whenever Lucas Sterling stood to greet someone. Curious glances lingered a little longer. Names were exchanged. Expressions shifted. Claire Whitmore noticed it all, though she pretended not to. Years ago, she would have been nervous under that kind of attention. Tonight, she simply observed. A server placed the final dinner course on the table. The scent of roasted herbs and fresh vegetables mixed with the warm fragrance of candles burning throughout the room. Soft music continued drifting through the ballroom while guests settled into comfortable conversations. Lucas thanked the server by name after reading it from the small badge pinned to her uniform. The young woman smiled in surprise. It was such a small gesture, but Claire noticed the effect immediately. People always remembered how they were treated. That was something Lucas understood naturally. Across the room, Ethan Brooks appeared increasingly distracted. He was still smiling. Still greeting guests. Still playing the role everyone expected him to play. But the rhythm felt forced now. Like an actor who suddenly realized the audience had become interested in someone else. Claire watched as one of Ethan's business associates approached their table. The man stopped beside Lucas and extended his hand. "Good to see you again." Lucas stood and shook it warmly. "Likewise." The conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet when the man returned to his table, two people immediately leaned toward him with questions. Claire noticed their reactions. So did Ethan. The distance between their tables was nearly 30 feet, but she could feel his attention. It arrived in waves throughout the evening. A glance. A pause. Another glance. The same man who once seemed so certain now appeared unsettled by something he could not identify. Vanessa Reed noticed it too. Claire saw her touch Ethan's arm and quietly ask him something. He responded quickly. Too quickly. Vanessa nodded, but her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced. Then another guest approached Lucas. This time it was an older woman wearing an elegant emerald dress. Her face brightened the moment she recognized him. Lucas greeted her respectfully, introducing Claire without hesitation. Not as an afterthought. Not as someone accompanying him. As someone important. Claire noticed the difference because she had spent years experiencing the opposite. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but when the woman walked away, she glanced back at Claire with a warm smile. Not curiosity. Respect. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward her plate. For years ago, she would have interpreted moments like these as proof of status. Tonight, she understood something deeper. Respect was not created by money. It was earned through character. And character revealed itself in hundreds of small moments that most people overlooked. The music shifted again as guests began moving toward the dance floor. Laughter filled the ballroom. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandeliers. Yet beneath the celebration, another current continued spreading through the room. Recognition. Curiosity. Quiet realization. Several guests had now recognized Lucas. Others were beginning to ask questions. Not loudly. Not publicly. But the whispers were growing. Claire could almost feel the moment approaching. The moment when someone would finally say his name loud enough for everyone to hear. Across the ballroom, Ethan watched another group gather briefly around Lucas before moving away. His smile remained in place. But his eyes told a different story. For the first time all evening, he no longer looked like the man controlling the room. And for the first time all evening, Claire realized that the shift was no longer coming. It had already happened. The recognition began with a single sentence spoken a little too loudly. Claire Whitmore was reaching for her glass when she heard it from a nearby table. Wait a second, that is Lucas Sterling. The words traveled through the air like a ripple across still water. Not dramatic. Not immediate. But impossible to stop once they started. Claire did not turn her head. She simply watched the reflection of the ballroom lights dance across her glass while conversations around her subtly shifted. The man who had spoken leaned forward toward his wife. Another guest joined the discussion. Then another. Within minutes, several people were quietly exchanging the same question. Could it really be him? Lucas seemed completely unaware of the growing attention. Or perhaps he noticed and chose not to react. He continued speaking with the same calm courtesy he had shown all evening. Meanwhile, curiosity spread from table to table. A woman near the dance floor pulled out her phone. An older businessman narrowed his eyes as though finally solving a puzzle that had bothered him for hours. Across the ballroom, Ethan Brooks noticed the change immediately. Claire saw it happen. He was speaking with a group of guests when one of them suddenly turned to look toward Lucas. Then another followed. Within seconds, the entire conversation shifted away from Ethan. His smile remained in place, but something behind it tightened. Vanessa Reed glanced toward Lucas as well. Who is he? Claire could not hear the question, but she recognized it from Vanessa's expression. Ethan answered. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. For the first time all evening, she looked directly at Claire. Not with pity. Not with superiority. With curiosity. The room was beginning to understand something Ethan had never expected them to learn. The wedding host soon approached their table. He greeted Lucas warmly and thanked him for attending. The interaction seemed ordinary enough until the host added something that several nearby guests overheard. I appreciate you taking time away from everything at Sterling Capital. That was the moment. The name landed with unmistakable clarity. Several conversations stopped entirely. Sterling Capital. One of the most influential investment firms in the country. The company appeared regularly in financial publications. Its acquisitions shaped industries. Its leadership conferences attracted executives from around the world. Claire watched the realization move through the room. People were no longer trying to remember where they recognized Lucas from. They knew. More importantly, they understood what his presence meant. Yet the most remarkable person at the table remained completely unchanged. Lucas thanked the host, smiled politely, and returned his attention to Claire. No announcement. No performance. No attempt to impress anyone. The contrast only made the revelation more powerful. Across the ballroom, Ethan stared for a second longer than necessary. Claire noticed him processing the information piece by piece. The surprise. The disbelief. The uncomfortable calculations happening behind his eyes. She remembered how much he had admired powerful people during their marriage. How often he measured success through titles, influence, and access. Now one of the most influential men in the room was sitting beside the woman Ethan had once treated as an afterthought. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. Yet Claire felt no triumph. No desire for revenge. Only a strange sense of distance from the person she used to be. Years ago, she would have wanted Ethan to understand her value. Tonight, she realized she no longer needed that understanding. Because the most important person in the room had recognized her worth long before anyone knew his name. And that, more than any title or fortune, was what made Ethan's growing realization impossible to escape. The ballroom had finally stopped asking who Lucas Sterling was. Now it was asking something else entirely. How had Claire Whitmore ended up beside him? The difference was subtle, but Claire felt it immediately. Earlier in the evening, people had looked at her through the lens of her past. She was Ethan Brooks's former wife. The woman sitting alone at the back table. The guest assigned to the least desirable seat in the room. Now those same eyes carried a different question. Somewhere between dinner and dancing, the story everyone thought they understood had begun to unravel. A slow song drifted through the ballroom as couples moved onto the dance floor. Golden light reflected off crystal chandeliers and polished marble. Servers cleared empty plates while guests continued exchanging quiet observations. Claire remained seated beside Lucas, watching the evening unfold without any desire to become part of its drama. That was another thing she had learned over the years. Peace was often found by refusing to compete for attention. Lucas leaned back comfortably in his chair. "You look thoughtful." Claire smiled. "I was just noticing how quickly people change their opinions." Lucas glanced around the room. Most people do not actually change their opinions. They change the information they base them on. Claire laughed softly. It sounded exactly like something he would say. Across the ballroom, Ethan stood near the dance floor with Vanessa. Their conversation appeared strained now. Not hostile. Just distracted. Vanessa occasionally glanced toward Claire and Lucas before looking away again. Ethan followed her gaze more than once. Claire felt no satisfaction watching it. What surprised her most was how little she cared. Years ago, she would have wanted answers. She would have wanted explanations for every disappointment, every betrayal, every moment that had left her questioning her worth. Tonight, those questions felt strangely irrelevant. Because the answers had never been the point. The point was who she had become afterward. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. An older woman approached their table. The same guest Lucas had spoken with earlier. She smiled warmly at Claire. "I have wanted to tell you something all evening." Claire looked up. "What is that?" The woman glanced between Claire and Lucas before answering. "I have known Lucas for nearly 10 years. I have watched powerful people try to impress him. Most fail." Claire smiled politely. The woman continued. Do you know what he talks about when your name comes up? Claire shook her head. Your resilience. The answer arrived so simply that it took a moment to settle. The woman smiled again. Not your appearance. Not your accomplishments. Not your circumstances. Your resilience. He admires that more than anything. Then she excused herself and walked away. Claire sat quietly for several seconds. Lucas looked mildly embarrassed. I did not tell her to say that. Claire laughed. I know. But inside, something shifted. Because for years she had believed wealth meant security. Then she believed it meant independence. Later she thought it meant success. Sitting there beneath the glow of chandeliers, she finally understood what true wealth actually looked like. It was being seen clearly by someone and valued anyway. It was being respected during your hardest seasons, not just your best ones. It was having someone recognize your strength before the world recognized your success. Across the ballroom, Ethan was still watching. But Claire realized something important. The greatest thing she possessed was not sitting in a bank account. It was not connected to a title or a company. It was the life she had built after losing everything she once thought she needed. And for the first time, she understood that no amount of money could purchase the peace she felt in that moment. As the evening moved toward its final hour, the ballroom gradually softened into a different kind of celebration. The loudest conversations had faded. The dance floor glowed beneath warm golden light. Guests lingered over coffee and dessert while musicians played their final songs. Claire Whitmore sat quietly for a moment, taking it all in. The chandeliers. The music. The laughter. The countless details she would probably never remember individually but would somehow never forget as a whole. Strange how life worked that way. The moments that changed everything rarely announced themselves. Lucas Sterling glanced at his watch before turning toward her. Ready? Claire smiled. I think so. They stood together. No grand exit. No attempt to attract attention. Just two people preparing to leave. Yet as they made their way across the ballroom, Claire noticed several guests watching them. Some smiled. Others nodded politely. A few seemed deep in thought. The assumptions they had carried into the evening were no longer the same ones they carried now. Near the entrance, Claire heard someone call her name. She turned and saw Ethan Brooks approaching. For a brief second, the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into the background. Ethan stopped a few feet away. Close enough for conversation. Far enough to preserve dignity. The confidence he had worn so effortlessly earlier in the evening was gone. Not entirely. But enough for Claire to notice. His expression carried something she had never expected to see directed toward her. Reflection. He glanced toward Lucas before returning his attention to Claire. You look happy. The words were simple. Honest. Perhaps the most honest thing he had said to her in years. Claire considered the statement before answering. I am. Ethan nodded slowly. As though hearing confirmation of something he had already suspected. Neither of them mentioned the past. Not the divorce. Not the disappointments. Not the years that followed. Some conversations no longer needed to happen. Time had already answered every question worth asking. For a moment, Ethan seemed as though he wanted to say more. Then he simply smiled. A small smile. Tired, but genuine. I am glad. Claire smiled back. Not because she had forgiven everything. Not because she had forgotten anything. But because carrying resentment no longer served a purpose. Take care of yourself, Ethan. He nodded once. Then stepped aside. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute. No dramatic confrontation. No final victory speech. No public humiliation. Just two people standing on opposite sides of a chapter that had ended years ago. Lucas offered his hand and Claire slipped hers into his. Together they walked toward the exit. Cool evening air greeted them as they stepped outside. The city lights stretched across the distance like scattered stars. Somewhere behind them, music continued drifting from the ballroom. Claire paused for a second at the top of the stone steps and looked back through the glass doors. She saw Ethan standing inside among the guests. Surrounded by people. Successful. Respected. Yet somehow smaller than he had seemed at the beginning of the night. Not because he had lost anything this evening. But because he had finally understood what he had lost years ago. Claire turned away and faced the city skyline ahead. The future no longer felt uncertain. It felt open. Lucas squeezed her hand gently. She smiled and took a step forward. Then another. And another. Leaving behind the room where everyone had measured wealth by appearances. Because the richest person to walk out of that ballroom was not the man with the largest company. It was not the person with the highest status. It was the woman who had lost everything, rebuilt herself in silence, and discovered that her greatest treasure had never been someone else's approval. She did not win him back. She won herself.